Hey, it's Dave Brown here, host of Now with Dave Brown on AMI. Check out this latest highlight from the show. The recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been called a code red for humanity. In a recent article published in the Globe and Mail, environmental writer Arno Kopecky says the public is missing the real takeaway from the IPCC report. The historical changes are already at hand. Arno Kopecky is the author of the forthcoming book, The Environmentalist's Dilemma, Promise and Peril in the Age of Climate Crisis, and he joins us this morning from Vancouver, BC. Hello, Arno. Thank you for getting up early for us today. We appreciate it.
Anything for you, Dave.
So I want to jump into this article that you wrote for the Globe and Mail, because on a week when I think a lot of us were spinning and kind of reeling from that report that was released by the United Nations, you took a little bit more of a positive outlook. What gives you the case for optimism regarding environmental changes facing the planet right now?
Well, it's a cautious optimism, to be sure, Dave. So my piece had two main thrusts, I think. The first one was, humanity has been here many, many times before. This is not our first brush with existential collapse. We live in North America. Talk to some of the indigenous neighbors that we have here, and they lost over 90% of their populations, as we know. And my parents are products of the Second World War. They were born in the Old World in Germany and Czechoslovakia. And the reason I'm a Canadian and was born and raised here was because of that intense calamity. Everywhere you look, every culture on the planet has had some crazy catastrophe. I grew up in the shadow of the Cold War, and so nuclear Armageddon was this thing. And I think one of the things that distinguishes our crisis from many of those is that nobody's trying to kill us. There's no armies coming. We're not being drafted to go and kill other people. We have a really good life. The challenge upon us is to simplify our lives, which is incredibly, surprisingly hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to be glib about the challenges ahead of us or the scale of loss that's already upon us. But I do think it's important, when despair and overwhelming anxiety are all around us, to step back a minute and take stock of how bad things have been before, and that humanity has emerged, and that we can still, drink coffee in the morning.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the one thrust. And then the other thing, I think, if as soon as you do a little bit of research into climate change and you try to figure out some stuff, you very quickly realize that there is an immense pool of thousands and thousands of people who are working on solutions. And these are intelligent, committed, brilliant people, inspiring. Many of them are all the way up at the top levels of government. They have power and influence. And I think it's crazy not to take inspiration and hope from that and to join that movement. There's almost 200 signatories to the Paris Agreement. That IPCC report that kicked all this off had over 700 authors from over 100 countries. Many of those countries are at war or close to it, but they put aside those differences to collaborate and come up with this really incredible blueprint of where we're at and how we can get out of here. So that, in a nutshell, is my case for optimism.
So let's talk about some of those individuals and some of those ideas and that blueprint. Is there anybody right now who you think is setting a good example, maybe creating a template for what other political leaders, other countries, other municipalities, provinces, like take your pick, might be able to follow to start creating some of this positive impact?
Well, don't look to Alberta, I can tell you that much. But although there are people within Alberta, Rachel Notley just announced the other day that she wants Alberta to become a superpower for renewable energy. So actually, and there's a good chance that she was going to win the next election. Joe Biden right now in the United States, obviously the United States is a treacherous example because they swing from, Obama to Trump to Biden. But right now, Biden has a $3.5 trillion climate deal on the table that has at least a good, decent chance of passing. That would be inspirational. China has set the most aggressive targets to decarbonize completely by 2050 or 60, I think. It's not soon enough. But the fact that China and the U.S. are now going to be involved in this sort of decarbonization race is going to really move the world aggressively towards that place. I don't know if there's any countries that are like, oh, that's how we do it. This is an incredibly complex, intractable problem. But micro examples abound. Already, every country in the G7, except Canada, is already lowering its emissions. and Canada's probably going to be there pretty soon. But all the other countries, even the United States, with all their crazy politics, their emissions have gone down a lot in the last few years because the business case makes sense because wind and solar are now cheaper than most fossil fuel forms of energy, and coal is on the way.
Yeah, that's something that I point to quite a bit in Amarillo, Texas, for example, which used to be a place that thrived on oil money. They've become a leader in wind energy. A place like Phoenix, Arizona, in the middle of the desert, you pretty much can't see a new house built without solar panels on the roof, right? So those are a lot of micro changes, but all those micro changes can have a big impact.
Absolutely. We've already, another case for optimism is, the initial business as usual trajectories that the IPCC was putting out in earlier reports had us on track for 5-6 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which would be so cataclysmic that let's not even go there. That has already lowered because of all these micro changes we're discussing and plans that are in place, and really the cost of renewable energy going down so much that even if we don't change anything, we're on a trajectory now for about 3.54 degrees. Still catastrophic. Let's not rest easy. But, the fact that I'll put this in the language of the pandemic, we're bending the curve, and we just got to keep bending harder and harder, and we can do it.
You mentioned some of the political back and forth that goes along with this issue. Of course, you mentioned a province like Alberta, where they've wavered between Jason Kenney and Rachel Notley in the last couple of years, and who knows what that next election is going to look like. But how do we kind of keep the public's attention on an existential crisis like climate change, but maybe not just keeping the public's attention on that, making sure that it's being focused and magnified onto the politicians as well?
Well, as soon as you figure that out, Dave, I'd like to co-write my next book with you.
Oh, right on. Okay, a writing opportunity. But you can still put my name on the second, though. That's all right. You can still go on top.
That's gracious of you. Thank you. Honestly, though, I think that is, of course, a key problem for climate communicators. How in this world that is just saturated with bombastic news, the fall of Kabul and the pandemic and American politics, how do we sustain this attention and effort? But honestly, the nature is doing a lot of the work for us. I don't need to tell anybody what this summer has been like. I live in BC, so it's been very smoky here, and first world problem. But you can't even plan a trip to the interior, which is such a big part of our lives in this province, of going to all the beautiful towns in the Okanagan and the Kootenays. There it is. People don't really need to be reminded, or less and less these days. It's true that there are huge pockets of denial out there, and there are people who don't equate increasing forest fires and drought and flood and hurricanes in New Orleans now. They don't make those connections with climate change. So, again, I'm not suggesting that we can just sit back. But I do think it is so obvious today that climate change is upon us, that urgency is just naturally there. You don't need to tell somebody whose house is on fire that they should be concerned. They're concerned. And so that's sort of the view that I take. And I think, if there weren't a million prognostications of calamity out there already, I would perhaps take a more dire tone. But I think part of what I'm trying to do is, amidst that general atmosphere of anxiety and horror and fear, provide a voice of something to move forward to, and give people a cause for action. And Catherine Hayhoe, who's one of Canada's great climate scientists and communicators, I'm pretty sure it's her who says, hope does not lead to action. Action leads to hope. And I really like that equation. I think the more we do, the more hope emerges from that, and I think that's a really nice message.
Arno, we can only cover so much ground in a couple minutes of an interview, but you do have a book that's being released in about a month's time, The Environmentalist's Dilemma: Promise and Peril in the Age of Climate Crisis. So I'm curious if you can give us sort of the 1 minute or 90-second pitch about that book, and maybe where folks can find it once it hits the shelves.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave. But that book is really about how do we engage with this crisis that is upon us. It's not just climate change. It's consumption and species extinction, the depletion of the oceans. And as we've been discussing right now, the crisis is so enormous that it's very easy to just throw your hands up in despair and think, well, what can I do about this? And so I looked at that, and again, like I've been saying, I think life is really good in many ways. We're living better lives than ever before. But at the same time, the world is collapsing all around us. And that dissonance is quite crazy making. And so I wrote a book of essays sort of exploring, zooming into a few different corners of that landscape of looking at how people are engaging with this crisis. I spent a year with Extinction Rebellion, the radical activist group. I profiled the only member of parliament in Alberta who believes in climate change. I looked into the history of my German family and how they dealt with World War II, a previous crisis. Those are some examples of the stories I get into in the book, and you can find it bookstores everywhere in October.
Arno, looking forward to that one being released. Thank you for making time for us bright and early today out there on the West Coast. All the best to you, and thank you for this perspective. That article you wrote in the Globe and Mail, which was actually read on AMI Audio's Globe and Mail reading show, gave me a little bit of hope after what was a pretty rough 10 days of despair after reading that report.
A little bit of hope is not bad in the present circumstances. Thank you, Dave. Real pleasure.
Thank you very much. That's Arno Kopecky. He is an environmental journalist. He's also the author of the upcoming book, The Environmentalist's Dilemma, Promise and Peril in an Age of Climate Change. That one's going to be released in October. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV or download the podcasts wherever you listen.